You buy a house, you find a tenant. The tenant pays rent. The rent covers the mortgage. Whatever's left over is yours every single month for as long as you own it. That's the pitch, and on paper it looks almost too simple. A machine that turns other people's money into your equity while you sleep. It isn't that simple, and the way it isn't simple explains almost everything about how real estate actually makes or destroys wealth for the person who owns one duplex and for the company that owns 80,000 houses. Start with the number every new landlord fixates on, the rent check. Say a property rents for $2,000 a month. The mortgage is $1,400. On a napkin, that's $600 a month in pure profit, $7,200 a year just for holding the deed. That math is the reason so many people get into rental property in the first place. It's also almost never what actually happens.
The rent check is gross income. What a landlord actually keeps is something else entirely, and the industry has a name for it: net operating income, or NOI. It's the money left over after every operating cost, not just the mortgage, but property taxes, insurance, maintenance, property management, and the periods when nobody's renting the place at all. Real estate investors have a rough rule of thumb for estimating this before they even run the exact numbers. Assume roughly half of the rent you collect will go to operating expenses, not counting the mortgage. Not the whole mortgage payment eats half. The operating costs alone, before debt service, tend to consume something in that range over the life of a property. That $600 profit a new landlord imagined can shrink to almost nothing once taxes go up, a water heater fails, and the unit sits empty for 6 weeks between tenants. That's the first crack in the popular version of the story. The spreadsheet most people build in their head only has one column. Real estate has two.
It helps to walk through where that missing half actually goes, because it doesn't disappear into one dramatic expense. It leaks out through a dozen small ones that rarely show up in the version of the story a seller tells a buyer. Property taxes rise almost every year, often independently of whether rents rise at the same pace. And in many places, a property gets reassessed at a higher value the moment it sells, meaning the tax bill can jump right after a new owner takes over. Not gradually, but immediately. Insurance has followed a similar path in much of the country, with premiums for landlord policies climbing sharply in regions exposed to storms, wildfire, or flooding, sometimes to the point where insurance alone erases a third of what looked like monthly profit. Then there's maintenance, which doesn't arrive as a steady monthly bill, but as a lump sum at the worst possible time: a roof, a furnace, a foundation issue, which is why experienced investors set aside a maintenance reserve every single month, whether anything breaks that month or not, treating a future $5,000 repair as if it were already a recurring expense. Add property management, typically 8 to 10% of collected rent if the owner doesn't want to personally handle late-night calls about a broken pipe, and turnover costs, cleaning, repainting, new flooring, and the rent lost during the weeks a unit sits empty between tenants. And the just collect the rent fantasy starts looking a lot more like running a small, unpredictable business than owning a savings account with a roof on it. To understand why, you have to separate two things that get lumped together as making money in real estate, because they behave like completely different investments wearing the same house. The first is cash flow, the money the property generates every month after every bill is paid. The second is appreciation, the property's value going up over time, plus the equity you build simply by paying down the loan. These two engines don't run on the same fuel, and a property can be winning at one while quietly losing at the other. This is where the first real surprise shows up. A property can be fully rented with rising rents in a hot market and still be losing money every single month. It sounds like a contradiction. It isn't. It's leverage doing exactly what leverage does. Here's the mechanism. When you buy a rental property with a mortgage, you're not really buying a house. You're buying a small slice of a house and borrowing the rest. Put 20% down on a $400,000 property, and you've put $80,000 of your own money to work controlling $400,000 of asset. If that property appreciates 5% in a year, that's a $20,000 gain, a 25% return on your actual $80,000 investment. That's the magic everyone talks about at dinner parties. Nobody at the dinner party mentions what happens in reverse. The same leverage that multiplies a 5% gain into a 25% return also multiplies a 5% loss into a 25% loss on your actual cash. And leverage doesn't only amplify price swings, it also creates a fixed monthly obligation that exists whether or not a tenant is paying. The mortgage doesn't care if the unit is vacant. It doesn't care if the air conditioner just died. It's due on the 1st, every month, regardless of what the property earned that month. That fixed cost is the quiet trade-off behind every leveraged real estate purchase. It turns a flexible expense into a rigid one. So a landlord can be sitting on real, growing equity. The house is genuinely worth more than it was, while the checking account tied to that property runs dry. The equity is real. It's also frozen. You can't pay a plumber with appreciation. You can only pay a plumber with cash flow, or with your own savings if the cash flow isn't there. That gap between what an asset is worth and what it's actually producing is one of the most common ways rental property investors get into trouble, and it's almost invisible from the outside because the listing price and the for rent sign both look healthy. There's a related trap that catches even careful investors, and it involves a metric that looks reassuring precisely because it's incomplete: occupancy. A 100-unit building at 98% occupancy sounds like a thriving asset, and in casual conversation, it usually gets treated as proof that everything's fine. But occupancy only measures whether units are filled. It says nothing about whether the rent being collected actually covers the cost of running the building, and nothing about whether tenants are paying on time, paying in full, or paying at all before eventually falling behind. A building can be full of tenants who are each a little behind on rent, held together by a landlord extending grace period after grace period rather than face the cost and vacancy risk of eviction. And from the outside, on a spreadsheet that only tracks occupancy, that building looks exactly as healthy as one collecting every dollar on time. The number that actually matters, collections as a share of what's owed, rarely gets advertised the way occupancy does, because occupancy is the number that makes a portfolio look good to a lender or a buyer. This is a version of a pattern that shows up across finance more broadly. A healthy-looking headline metric can mask a much weaker number sitting one layer beneath it, and the gap between the two only becomes visible when something forces a closer look. Which raises a question worth sitting with. If rent isn't really what determines a property's price, what is? The honest answer is a number most casual buyers never calculate: the capitalization rate, or cap rate. It's the net operating income divided by the property's price, expressed as a percentage, essentially what return an all-cash buyer would earn before any mortgage is involved. A property earning $20,000 a year in NOI, priced at $400,000, has a 5% cap rate. This single number is the actual pricing engine of the entire rental market, far more than the number on the for rent sign, because it's how professional investors, appraisers, and lenders decide what a property is worth relative to every other property competing for the same capital. And this is where interest rates enter the story, and where the whole system becomes far more interconnected than most owners realize. When interest rates rise, borrowing money to buy real estate becomes more expensive. Investors then demand a higher cap rate to justify buying, because if a risk-free savings account is suddenly paying 5%, nobody's going to accept a 4% return on a leveraged, illiquid house instead. But NOI, the actual rent minus actual expenses, doesn't jump overnight just because rates went up. So if the required return goes up while the income underneath it stays flat, there's only one variable left that can move to make the math work. The price of the property has to come down. This is the mechanism that connects a decision made at a central bank to what happens to the guy who owns one rental duplex 3 states away. He never has to see a Federal Reserve statement to feel its effects. His mortgage rate resets, his refinance quote comes in worse than expected, and the value of his property softens, all from the same underlying shift, arriving through completely different doors. Now, trace what happens when that mechanism plays out over years instead of moments, because this is the chain reaction that has decided the fate of more real estate investors than any single bad tenant ever has. It starts small. Interest rates rise. A landlord who financed a property with an adjustable rate mortgage or who needs to refinance a loan that's coming due suddenly faces a much higher monthly payment on the same property generating the same rent. The $600 a month cushion from the napkin math is gone, replaced by a negative number. For a while, the landlord can absorb it, dip into savings, delay a repair, hope rents catch up. But rents don't always catch up quickly, especially in markets where tenants are already stretched. So the negative cash flow persists. Multiply that one landlord by thousands of landlords facing the same refinance wall at the same time, and you get a secondary pressure, a wave of owners who all need to sell, or who stop maintaining their properties because there's no spare cash for upkeep, or who default outright.
That wave of forced sellers pushes prices down for everyone else too, including landlords who weren't in trouble at all, but whose property is now worth less because the market just repriced around them. And a property that drops in value is a property that's harder to refinance on decent terms, which pushes the next wave of owners toward the same cliff. One person's forced sale becomes the comparable sale that determines the next appraisal, which becomes the reason the next refinance falls through. The failure doesn't stay contained. It spreads through the exact same pricing mechanism that made everyone feel rich a few years earlier. This isn't a hypothetical chain. It's close to the actual sequence that unfolded after the 2008 housing crash, and it created the conditions for one of the strangest developments in the history of American rental housing. Wall Street itself became a landlord. Here's the case study, because it shows the entire mechanism operating at a scale no individual investor could match.
After the 2008 crash, roughly 10 million American homeowners went through foreclosure between 2006 and 2014. That left an enormous number of single-family houses sitting empty at deeply depressed prices. The exact moment cap rate logic says property becomes attractive, because prices had fallen while the underlying need for housing hadn't. Private equity firm Blackstone saw the opportunity clearly. Starting around 2011 and 2012, through a company it built called Invitation Homes, Blackstone began buying foreclosed single-family houses in bulk, at a pace that reportedly reached up to $100 million a week during the first year, fixing them up and renting them to families, some of whom, in a detail that captures the entire irony of the moment, had lost homes of their own in the same crash that made this buying spree possible. The strategy worked exactly the way leveraged real estate is supposed to work when prices are low and rates are cheap. Invitation Homes scaled rapidly, eventually controlling tens of thousands of homes across multiple states, and used the rental income from its growing portfolio to help secure financing for buying even more homes. Cash flow feeding acquisition, acquisition feeding scale, scale feeding negotiating power on financing. By 2017, the company was large enough to go public on the New York Stock Exchange. Later, it merged with a competitor, and the combined company owned roughly 82,000 homes across more than a dozen markets, valued at somewhere around $11 billion.
But the part of this story that matters most for understanding rental economics isn't the scale. It's how the income got financed. In late 2013, Blackstone worked with major banks to bundle the rental payments from thousands of single-family houses, just over 3,000 of them in one notable deal, into a bond that investors could buy, using the underlying houses as collateral. In plain terms, the monthly rent checks from thousands of individual tenants were packaged together and sold to Wall Street as a security, the same basic technique that turned mortgage payments into mortgage-backed securities before 2008. The entire structure rested on one assumption stacked underneath another: that rent would keep flowing, that tenants would keep paying, that the cash flow would keep being greater than the cost of servicing the debt used to buy the houses. Remove that assumption, and the structure built on top of it doesn't fail gracefully. It fails all at once, the same way a stack of cards doesn't lose one card at a time. That's the same fragile chain an individual landlord with one mortgage duplex is exposed to. Invitation Homes just built it at industrial scale, with better lawyers and cheaper capital.
It's worth pausing on why this move was even possible, because it reveals something counterintuitive about who the real customer is in this kind of deal. It's tempting to assume the tenant is the customer. After all, the tenant is the one signing the lease and writing the rent check. But once that rent gets bundled into a bond and sold to institutional investors, the tenant becomes something closer to raw material, a predictable, recurring cash flow that makes the bond attractive to a pension fund or an insurance company on the other end of the transaction. The actual customer in the bond deal is the investor buying the security, the one Invitation Homes and its banking partners needed to convince that thousands of individual tenants, most of whom the buyer would never meet, would keep paying rent reliably enough to make the bond worth holding. The house that looks like the product is really just the collateral. The rent is the product, and the tenant, the person actually living in the home, is the raw material generating it. A subtle shift in who the system is actually built to serve, and one that helps explain why maintenance complaints and fee disputes became such a recurring theme for large corporate landlords in the years that followed. When the tenant is the input rather than the customer, the incentive to keep them happy competes directly with the incentive to keep the cash flow as high and as cheap to produce as possible.
The company didn't collapse. By late 2019, Blackstone had exited its position entirely, selling its remaining shares and, according to reporting on the sale, taking in roughly $7 billion total, more than double what it had originally invested. From a pure return standpoint, the bet paid off spectacularly. But the exit reveals something worth noticing. Blackstone was the seller, not the long-term holder. The firm that best understood the mechanics of leveraged rental income, including its risks, was the one that got out near the top, while a new generation of institutional and individual buyers stepped in to own the same assets at higher prices and, in many cases, less favorable cap rates than the ones Blackstone had originally bought at. The industry adapted around that reality in a few visible ways. Large single-family landlords increasingly moved toward build-to-rent, constructing new homes specifically designed to be rented rather than buying up existing housing stock, partly to reduce competition with individual homebuyers and partly to control construction costs directly instead of inheriting deferred maintenance on older houses. Companies tightened underwriting standards, focusing acquisitions on properties with a clearer path to growing net operating income rather than simply betting on appreciation. Smaller landlords, meanwhile, responded to the same rate and expense pressures by shopping harder for insurance, self-managing properties to cut the cost of a property manager, and building larger cash reserves before buying, essentially trying to insulate themselves from the exact chain reaction that had squeezed so many owners before them. Tenant advocacy groups and some local governments also pushed back, filing complaints and lawsuits over maintenance issues and fees at large corporate landlords, a reminder that the tenant paying the rent is not a passive variable in the system either. Their experience and their willingness to keep paying is the entire foundation everything else is built on. So, what does owning a rental property actually look like, honestly, across the range of outcomes, rather than the one number on the napkin?
In the best case, a landlord buys at a fair price with a healthy cap rate, finances at a reasonable rate, self-corrects for realistic vacancy and maintenance costs from the start, and holds long enough for both engines, cash flow and appreciation, to work in the same direction. Rent slowly outpaces expenses. The loan balance shrinks. Years later, the property is worth substantially more, throwing off real monthly income on top of that growing equity. This outcome is achievable, and it's exactly what draws people into the asset class. In the realistic middle case, the property performs close to break-even for years, covering its own costs, building equity slowly through loan paydown and modest appreciation without generating much spendable cash flow at all. The owner's real return shows up mostly on paper, in home equity, and mostly becomes usable only when the property is eventually sold or refinanced. This is a perfectly normal outcome, but it's a far cry from the extra $600 a month pitch that got most people interested in the first place. In the negative case, the one the chain reaction describes, a landlord buys near a market peak, underestimates the real operating costs, gets hit by a rate reset or a bad stretch of vacancy at the same time, and ends up feeding the property cash every month just to avoid default, sometimes for years, before eventually selling at a loss into a soft market created by other owners in the exact same position. The house didn't fail. The math around the house did.
What separates these three outcomes usually isn't luck, and it isn't the property itself. It's whether the owner understood from day one that they were never simply buying a rent check. A rental property is a leveraged position on a stream of future payments from people whose ability and willingness to pay can change, wrapped around a fixed debt obligation that doesn't bend to accommodate a bad month, sitting inside a pricing system that reprices the entire asset every time the cost of money moves anywhere in the economy. The rent is real. The tenant is real. But underneath the tenant is a much larger, much less visible machine. Cap rates, borrowing costs, reserve requirements, refinancing cycles, quietly deciding what that rent check is actually worth and what it will cost to keep collecting it. That's the part the napkin math leaves out, not because it's hidden on purpose, but because it only becomes visible when something forces you to look. A rate hike, a bad year, a competitor 80,000 houses larger than you learning the same lesson at a scale big enough to make headlines. The house is the part everyone sees. The leverage is the part that decides who actually wins.